Today we're looking at the Cold War Continues, Unit 7, Notes number 5. So I'm going to be giving you guys a handout for Notes number 4, which will discuss the Korean War. So Eisenhower's Cold War policies. Dwight D. Eisenhower, also known as Ike, was elected president in 1952. John Foster Dulles was Ike's Secretary of State, and so he didn't want to just contain communism, he wanted to eliminate it. So remember, the policy of containment was under Truman right after World War II, so now we're in the 50s, and so different presidents have different approaches. So Dulles favored building more nuclear weapons. He believed that only the threat of nuclear war would stop the Soviets. So this policy of brinkmanship, the idea of going to the brink of war without actually starting a war. So this is where we begin to see kind of the arms race where the United States, the Soviet Union, were both looking to see who can build the more powerful weapon. So we both had, at this time, atomic weapons. Now they're looking into hydrogen weapons. And this concept of brinkmanship is that we both know that we could each launch a nuclear weapon at each other. But are we going to do that, knowing that the other side has this weapon? But just that thought that we could go to nuclear war. And so this really kind of overtakes, I guess you want to say, like the mindset of people. Like this was an actual threat that people in the 1950s, in the 1960s dealt with. People built bomb shelters for the possibility of nuclear war. So it definitely was something that lingered over people's minds. So the Eisenhower Doctrine. In January of 1957, President Eisenhower issued the Eisenhower Doctrine. This declared the right of the U.S. to help any nation in the Middle East trying to resist communist aggression. Using the doctrine, Ike sent Marines to Lebanon in 1958. So it's a little bit of a continuation of the Truman Doctrine, kind of more specific, that we are going to help countries defend against communism if they feel threatened. We need to keep communism from expanding. So something about Eisenhower, if you guys remember, he was the general that commanded the D-Day attack. And so he was very popular, seen as a war hero, and so that helped him to gain, to be elected as president during the 1950s. So changes in the Soviet Union. In March of 1953, Joseph Stalin died. Joseph Stalin had been the leader of the Soviet Union since the 1930s. So Nikita Khrushchev became his successor. Many political prisoners jailed under Stalin were freed. So just because they were against Stalin didn't necessarily mean that they were against Khrushchev. The Soviet Union remained a communist dictatorship and a rival to the U.S. The Warsaw Pact forms. In 1955, the Soviets established a new organization called the Warsaw Pact. And this was in direct kind of relation to NATO. So we created NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization for non-communist countries. And so the Warsaw Pact was a military alliance between Soviet-dominated countries of Eastern Europe that were communist. And so it's just their version of NATO, that they don't want to be attacked by any of the NATO countries, so they also want to feel secure. So it's their answer to NATO. The Warsaw Pact was under the control of the Soviet Union, and the nations promised to defend one another if attacked. The creation of SEATO. The U.S. and its anti-communist allies created a new organization, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, SEATO. These nations agreed to work together to resist communist aggression in Asia. So now the focus is kind of moving. Because, again, we want to have containment. We don't want to see communism spreading. So what's happened in Europe has happened. Now we start to see that potential threat spreading into Asia. And that's where SEATO comes in. So members of SEATO included Australia, Great Britain, France, New Zealand, the Philippines, and Thailand. SEATO and the U.S. supported the creation of a new anti-communist nation in 1955, South Vietnam. The U.S. provided the majority of the military and economic support. So trouble in Vietnam. So most people feel that the Vietnam War, the escalation of the war was 1960s, 1970s, but Vietnam was having issues even before World War II. So in 1954, France lost control of their Southeast Asian colony of Vietnam. And even before that, hold on, let me look real quick. Okay. So even before that, Vietnam had been a territory of France. But then during World War II, Vietnam was taken over by the Japanese during their Japanese aggression. And so once the war was over and Japan had left or was defeated, Vietnam thought that they would be independent. They wanted to be their own independent country. But France saw it as an opportunity for them to reclaim their territory, which they did, but there was a lot of fighting going back and forth between the Vietnamese people that wanted to be independent and didn't want French control, and France wanting to take back their territory. So in 1954, France lost control of their Southeast Asian colony of Vietnam. And so during this time period, the Vietnamese people, who were led by Ho Chi Minh, they felt that the U.S. would support their quest to have independence. But the thing that hindered the U.S. from supporting them was the fact that Ho Chi Minh wanted to make Vietnam communist, and we could not support that. So instead, we supported France in reclaiming their territory, but in 1954, that ended. They lost. So peace talks resulted in Vietnam being divided into northern and southern parts, which is what we see, which is what happened with Korea. The North came under the control of communist leader Ho Chi Minh. The peace agreement also called for an election in 1956 where voters would decide what type of government Vietnam would have. The U.S. could not risk the possibility of a communist victory. We did not want to see another country fall under communist control. So here are a few pictures. We have a picture of Ho Chi Minh, who was the leader of this Vietnamese independence. He had spent time in the Soviet Union, and he liked the ideals of communism. He felt that that could benefit the Vietnamese people. But again, the U.S. did not want to see that happening. So here we have a map of Vietnam. So we see South Vietnam, North Vietnam, and at this point it is divided. So Ho Chi Minh is in control of the North, and the U.S. is supporting a Vietnamese leader in the South. So we will continue to talk about Vietnam, not in our next unit, but in Unit 9, which will pick up after testing, so not until April. But it's just important for you to recognize that this Vietnam situation had so much more history than just, being a war in the 1960s. So much was happening to kind of lead up to the escalation. So that's it. Make sure you do your key terms. We will be having our key term quiz on Friday, February 28th.